right, everybody, I will call this meeting to order. This is our inaugural Committee of the Whole meeting, so welcome, everybody. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the shared lands of the Coast Salish people. Also, I just want to say that our CAO regrets that he can't be here tonight. He had some minor surgery, so unfortunately that's prevented him from attending. And I do want to give an enthusiastic welcome to Chris Payne, who is our new Director of Finance, and first day on the job today, and right into the frying pan. So welcome. With that, I'll look for an approval of the agenda.
So moved.
We have a mover. I don't believe we need a seconder for Committee of the Whole, but Councillor Nault?
Yes, I would like to propose a motion that items 3.1 and 3.3 be referred to the next Committee of the Whole meeting so that adequate written documentation can be provided. I have three reasons for this. As provided, those had no paperwork at all. It does not inform the public about what content we're discussing. The public has no way to prepare questions or to be prepared to provide input. Second reason, it doesn't give council the ability to prepare in any way. And the third reason, since we do not keep verbatim minutes, there is no proper paper trail following the meeting. That would enable future councillors or this council to review why decisions were reached. So I would move that those two items be referred to the next Committee of the Whole where proper paperwork can be provided.
Okay, we have a motion of deferral. Any discussion? Mayor Hamilton?
I had an opportunity to do a review with the CAO on this, and the document 3.1 is a PowerPoint presentation, which is very difficult to get context around when it's pictures or word quote references, and it is very unfortunate that he's been unable. But there are no decisions, there is no resolution, there's no it basically is things like
point of order. Motion for referral, you can comment on the appropriateness of the motion and no further debate.
Thank you. So I will call the question on the motion. All those in favor? Opposed? The motion is defeated. With that, can I have an approval of the agenda as is?
I think we already did that.
I think we did that.
We'll move on, and thank you.
We didn't vote, though.
No. Okay, all those in favor on the motion as on the agenda as in front of us? Sorry, thank you.
No, I'm just voting.
Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? It's carried. Thank you. Second item on the agenda is public participation. So with this Committee of the Whole structure, we have several opportunities for the public to get up to the mic and speak. At the beginning of the evening, and then on each agenda item, and then finally at the end of the evening, there's the opportunity for the public to provide additional input. So with that, I will open it up to the public. If you have any questions or comments. Seeing none, we will jump right into 3.1 under new business. Now, I will say, as the mayor had alluded to, this PowerPoint is difficult to go through without the CAO walking us through it. It's more of an information type of PowerPoint. However, I will draw council's or committee's attention to the second to last page. And this is really the what staff are wanting us to consider. Certainly there is an emotion that is expected out of this tonight, but there are three fundamental questions that staff want us to consider as our Director of Finance is going through his report. The first bullet is tax rate limitations before any contemplated new services. Are there any new services that committee is interested for to consider and that staff should look at building into the budget. And finally, how do we want to use any new tax revenue as a result of new development? So I'll just ask committee to toss those around in your heads as our Director of Finance is going through his presentation. And with that, I think we'll go right into your presentation, Chris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and pleased to be with you today.
Sorry, Councillor Day?
Since you gave the overview, would it not be appropriate to offer the community an opportunity to give input?
On those three items?
Yes.
My thought was we would go through the presentation that the Director of Finance has with those in mind, and certainly if the public had some input on that, then we would take it then. Yeah, but thank you. Chris?
Thank you. So good evening, Mayor and Council. Before you have a report outlining a recommended 2018 through 2022 financial planning approach, and what the intent of this report is to really develop for the city a process by which we develop our budget for you, and it's based on budget preparation principles, best practices. So what we're not looking to council for direction today is specific direction on a line-by-line basis. We're not going to be reviewing the 2017 budget on a line-by-line basis, nor the proposed 2018 numbers. However, we're just looking to council for endorsement on how we go about preparing the plan. So as you're aware, the community charter requires that our financial plan be prepared and a bylaw be adopted prior to May 15th of 2018, and so that's what we're aiming towards. The financial planning approach as presented has got four main financial planning principles presented. Some things that you'll be familiar with, such as fiscal responsibility and keeping our tax rates and our utility rates affordable. One thing possibly less familiar is principles of sustainable infrastructure replacement and capital asset optimization. And those are principles we'll discuss in more detail further on in the presentation, as well as in the financial planning process. It's really something that municipal government is municipal governments everywhere are turning their mind to when considering long-term financial planning. So I would contend that the financial plan is council's, I call it loudest policy document. It's a very realistic translation of council's strategic direction and vision for the community into numbers. The difficulty with a financial plan document is that it can often be difficult to translate what the numbers mean in terms of service delivery for the community. So with that in mind, the city is hoping to prepare its 2018 financial plan from a service level perspective. And that provides a number of opportunities and a number of advantages to a different approach. First and foremost, you're able to present a financial plan in a way that shows the services that the citizens can expect to enjoy from that financial plan. Second of all, management and staff prepare the financial plan with the intention of maintaining current service levels absent of specific council direction. So council policy therefore can provide direction to staff in terms of varying service level. You can direct staff to increase service level, to enhance service levels, to decrease service levels, and you can and staff can quantify and the financial impact of that. So I wouldn't say that the financial plan that would come before you would be less detailed, but it's trading one sort of detail for a different sort of detail. Instead of providing the total cost of the engineering department, we would provide the total cost of the services provided by the engineering department and what the cost to maintain current service levels that the city has asked for so far. So the financial plan would continue to integrate strategic planning decisions that have been made, quantified, and prepared in the 5-year plan. And as well, we would like to start considering sustainable infrastructure replacement on a more realistic level. As you're likely aware, the city has embarked on plans to develop an asset management plan, and as part of that plan, it's important for the city to consider what is the cost, the full life cycle cost of providing the services that those assets are used for. So if we build a road, it's not just the capital cost of investing in that road in the year of construction, it's also how much are we going to have to put aside to ensure that future generations can use that road. Do we have sustainable funding for that? So we want to turn our mind to that sort of thinking in all of our capital projects, all of our current assets and services, as well as any incremental service level changes that council may wish to make. So in the 2017 financial plan, council approved a number of capital and special projects. Again, from a principal standpoint, the intention is to, if those capital projects are underspent or still ongoing, to carry those forward for continued progress in 2018, as well as begin the projects that were approved in the 2018 year of the 2017 plan. So those projects would be brought forward in the 2018 financial plan for council consideration with the assumption that they're already underway. The Deputy Director of Finance will go through some of the projects that we've been through in high-level detail after I've done the bulk of this presentation. It's just to give council an idea of the remaining projects that would carry forward through 2018. So when looking at operating revenues, the city's revenues are mostly sustainable. They're mostly predictable. They're tax revenues, obviously, and utility revenues. There's some less predictable revenues, casino revenues, and in particular, non-market change or new construction revenues. And again, the principled approach to use of that use of those revenues is a policy decision of council, and the recommended approach is to link new construction revenues to services that are more expensive as a result of the pressures from new construction. So, for instance, if a new home is built, that's going to put pressure on our existing operating expenses for the planning department to help with the rezoning application to prepare materials for council. And so the more new construction revenue that results from new construction, the more pressure it's going to put on the city of Colwood to continue its current service level with existing resources. So the idea is to really link non-market change or new construction revenue to the existing operating pressures that are already there. Now, in terms of talking about operating expenditures, the city's operating expenditures are subject to many factors that are simply outside the control of the city. General inflationary factors, contracts, things of such nature, and so those items will naturally put an upward pressure, or sometimes a decreasing pressure on our operating budgets. But again, if we tackle the preparation of this financial plan from a service level standpoint, we simply incorporate those operating changes into our operating plans with the assumption and intention of maintaining current service levels. So, for instance, salaries is a common input into most of the department budgets. We have a collective agreement that we have to abide by. We have to abide by the increases in that collective agreement. Naturally, the operating budget for that department is going to rise just to maintain existing service levels. So that would be incorporated into the operating budget. So we've proposed for you a budget cycle timeline that we'd like to use long term, and what we're really getting into the habit at the city here is approaching the budget as an ongoing, always moving thing. It's not something that we are struggling to do at the end of the year. It's something that we're checking into on a regular basis. So some of the timelines in the proposed budget cycle timeline are accelerated from what you're used to. For instance, we're recommending that in the summer of 2018, we check back in with council and we'd say, so here's what we think our budget approach should be for the 2019 year. How did you like our 2018 approach? Are there any tweaks you want to make? Any policy statements you want to make? And that sends a signal to staff and management to get the boots rolling and moving forward on providing our budget a bit early. We'd also like to come back to council at the beginning of November or the end of October, much like you're used to, and see Q3 reports with full year projections. So we can show to City Council that okay, we expect this is how much of a surplus you'll have to be able to use to fund special projects, or if there are any other concerns for the ongoing rolling budget cycle, we can bring that to the attention of council early on in the stage, and we can tackle it then. So with that, Jen's going to go over some of the timelines for you, and just looking at some of the timelines, it's important for us to consider the dates for a couple of reasons. First of all, we want to provide plenty of opportunity for council to provide input and direction on the budget. And so the committee of the whole dates that we're recommending would provide council with that opportunity, and we just would need direction at those dates. I lost my train of thought for my last point, but that'll come up. And then Jen will go over with you just in the high-level detail some of the projects and their progress for 2017. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Jen.
Thank you. So Appendix A outlines the proposed 2018 budget timeline, and tonight really is your opportunity to provide feedback on this timeline. If you see any glaring issues with proposed meeting dates or that sort of thing, we would appreciate that feedback tonight. We are hoping to bring this timeline forward to council next Monday, December 18th. Overall, this timeline is very similar to the structure that we followed last year. We're proposing 5 committee of the whole meetings, and we have slated in a 6th one should we need it. This is following tonight's meeting. So the intention is the first meeting in the new year would be January 15th, and that would be primarily for the grant and aid applicants to come and speak to their applications. And following that meeting, we're looking to have our budget workbooks locked down by the end of January, so that all changes from management, all proposed budgets are input. We would then have that information ready and prepared for the February 5th proposed committee of the whole meeting, and that would be the first meeting that we would look into the 2017 budget and actual variances and start to comment on where the 2018 core budget is looking. And following that meeting, we've proposed a double header, similar with what you've seen in past years, and that's for Monday, February 19th and Tuesday, February 20th. And the intention there is that we'll really be getting into the proposed one-time operating and capital projects for the 5-year financial plan. Moving along, we're hoping to have the budget more or less wrapped up by the Monday, March 5th committee of the whole meeting. To note, we have the year-end audit following that date, and that then gives us time to make the necessary updates for all of our parcel tax rolls and that sort of thing. And we are proposing to bring forward the financial plan bylaw in early April, and following that, bring forward the property tax bylaw. So this proposed timeline does ensure that we meet our statutory obligations and deadlines, and I'm quite confident that it does give us sufficient time, similar with what we've seen in the last couple of years. One of the reasons that we would like to have this approved next week is so that we may send out the invitations to the grant and aid applicants before we close for Christmas closure, and line those presentations up for January 15th. Oh, any comments, please?
Great. Thank you. So with that, I will open it up to the public. If you have any questions or feedback for our finance staff based on the comments from Chris and Jen. Also, looking for some feedback in terms of the first item that we discussed, if there's any thoughts on tax rate ceiling, I guess, so to speak, any new services that we may be interested in, and if there's any desire to give staff some direction in terms of how we want to utilize the new tax revenue as a result of new development. So with that, before I come to committee. Yep. Go ahead. Yeah, oh no, sorry, Rob was asking me a question.
Richard Marchand, 3508 Aloha Avenue. Service delivery. I like the concept. I've worked in a number of agencies and organizations that have adopted service delivery, but it comes with an obligation, I'm sure you're aware of this, in terms of maintaining that service level and the service level agreements and the metrics that go with this. These all come at a cost. So as you're making your financial plan and you're putting your workbooks together, the skill testing question that I would ask as a taxpayer is, what are your metrics that you're trying to maintain? Because that will come with a cost, and it will come with an expectation. Service level metrics, I think, is something that easily gets brushed aside, and then it's to your own detriment by doing so. Asset management. I stood before this, well, not this group, the council, a couple years ago, and I asked a very simple question about what was Colwood's asset management plan. I was happy to see that in this year's financial plan, there was an expenditure in fiscal year 2017 with a rollover for fiscal year 2018. So my question that comes out of that is, how much of the asset management effort is underpinning your financial planning to date? And at some point, I'd like to know when the asset management plan will come to fruition, because I view asset management plans and OCPs as lockstep complementary to each other. OCP talks about what we want to do for the future. Asset management plan talks about what we're doing to maintain what we already have. And the two of them should be supporting what takes place as part of the financial plan for Colwood. That's my opinion. Take it or leave it as you see fit. The other thing that those plans do, both the asset management plan and the OCP, is they are major communication documents for you, council, and the staff to have a dialogue with the taxpayers and citizens of Colwood. And so to that mind, in my mind anyway, they are both vitally important to get completed as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. You did have a couple of questions in there about asset management. So Chris or Jen, are you able to elaborate as to where we are with the asset management plan? Or Nikki, either one? Perfect.
Through the chair, yes, we did have a line item. It was designated as a one-off, and I'll remind council that staff did bring forward a report to council with regard to the fact that it was definitely not a one-off item, and that it would be introduced in our core budget to move forward with an asset management plan in incremental steps so that we can get to a final result. So that definitely is in the works.
Yes.
Do you have a tentative timeline as to when this is going to be delivered?
Through the chair, asset management will always and forever be an ongoing process. So we would need to define what all our assets are, figure out what our maintenance schedules are for those, figure out what our capital plan would be associated with them, determine disposal as well as incremental increases, what the maintenance costs are associated with that. There's a lot of work that does need to be done, and it will definitely take time to do that. And then once we get all that in place, then it's time to start looking at it, tweaking it, figuring out how we constantly improve it. So it will be a many-year process. We are definitely starting with ensuring that we will have detailed design for shovel-ready projects, for example, because that hasn't necessarily happened in the past. and we can only move forward incrementally. But it's definitely top of mind, especially for it's critical in engineering, but it's critical for the city as a whole. We need to know what our assets are and how we're managing them, because that is why we're here.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public that has any questions or comments for staff? Dave.
Mayor, council staff, Dave Saunders, 813 Pears Road, current stakeholder, long-time business in Colwood. As a bit of history, and I stand before you, I looked at quickly through the pictures and everything like that. The direction to see where the city is and to set real tax limitations on our new growth is to be commended. So whoever that brainchild was, I like that idea. When we look up here and we see tax rate limitations before anything contemplated, new services, it says new services, use of real growth, new tax revenue from new development. I stand here before you as a mayor at that time in a global recession back in 2000, 2008. I stand up here before you as a bit of history as well, is that at that point in time we got hit with a $1.2 million loss out of commercial tax base from Lehigh moving away. We had to, when I opened up the books and actually looked at them with our excellent finance department at the time, we had to replace reserve funds. We had to start paying legally back to the government what we owed them. We had to basically get our financial house in order. We were looking at a 28% tax increase, and not a lot of citizens maybe in this audience know that, but I certainly haven't forgot it because I took it on the chin. I had groups organized against us at that time, but we took a hard stance that we had to do this to get our house in order, with a clear understanding that as soon as the new developments started to take place, that those old taxes that we had to initiate back at that time would be replaced. And I would hope that before we spend anything on new, that we replace that old tax loss back then, because it's imperative that we do that, because at that point in time, we raised our BC assessment values and we facilitated rezonings in our municipality that negated a 28% tax increase, with a clear understanding through our excellent finance department that we were always going to replace, and if at the time that new development happened in such a fashion that we would look to our city to see what the challenges were, but that if we could reverse the taxes, make them negative, then we would. So I don't think that we're still at that function that our house is completely stable at this point in time. As one of the longest business owners in the city of Colwood, I can tell you that our business tax rate and our tax liability is still there. We don't know exactly what it takes to run our city from a public works perspective, which we were working on at that time. I still don't know, and I still don't see all that information. What does it take, or what does it cost to fix a pothole, as opposed to what it costs to run our city? And I think until we flesh that out, then we shouldn't, or ought to be, not looking at new expenditures until such time that these initiatives, such as looking at our infrastructure, has been fully realized. You have a huge monumental task ahead of you. We do have a great mayor and council. We do have great staff. So I just brought that bit of history back. I didn't want to stand up, but I don't want people that haven't sat at this table not to realize it, or the people that not in the audience that didn't live and breathe it to not reflect on the past, because I certainly lived it. I won't ever forget it. And I will hold those to account in a positive fashion rather than what I experienced as a negative fashion. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Anyone else before we bring it to committee? Seeing none, open it up. Councillor Nault?
Yes, two quick comments. The grant and aid application timeline seems to be awfully tight. if the invitations haven't even gone out yet, it's turning into the Christmas season, and they're supposed to be able to present to council by the 15th of January. It seems like a very tight timeline. I'm wondering if you think that's a reasonable timeline?
Jen?
Thank you for the question. I do think it's reasonable in that we have communicated that the expectation is that the meeting will be in mid to late January. So every single body that has applied to the city, we have let them know that we expect the grant and aid meeting to be held mid to late January, and that as soon as the meeting date was confirmed with council, we would let them know when that meeting is, which would be this coming Tuesday.
Thank you. I'm comforted by that. Grant and aid is never my favorite part of the budget, so it's always controversial, and there's always a lot more people asking for money than we're prepared to grant in tax dollars. The second comment I have is I too am very concerned about Colwood's asset management. We seem to have been spinning our wheels on that project for 3 years, and the answers I hear tonight is we still don't really have any estimate of how long this is going to take. I would like to see, in time for the budget process, a written timeline on the asset management and steps to complete it, and cost estimates that would be reasonable. I know we did that one with the CRD just lately. That's going to be an ongoing expense for GIS. But I really would feel more comfortable if I had some idea that there was actually a plan in place. Right now, there doesn't seem to be.
Thank you. Mayor Hamilton?
No, mine was just on Councillor Nault. The grant in aid applications have already gone out and been back and received. This will be just the presentations of those, or opportunity to present for.
Thank you. The timeline says the invitations will be going out after this meeting, so.
That's just for the meeting date, but I think their applications
Yeah, that's just
already had.
the application. They were to have their applications in by the middle of November.
Councillor Day?
Thank you. Also, very aware of asset management and its importance in the city. It's become kind of like the whole world just woke up to asset management in the last few years. An example in point was this building. In fact, I recall asking what the asset management plan was for City Hall, and we just hadn't caught up with ourselves because the answer was it's still brand new. And of course, it wasn't brand new anymore by that point in time, but you know, time marches on and things catch up with us. One of the things that isn't really captured anywhere in the documentation coming forward tonight that I think needs to be noted is that probably the largest asset that the city has is our staff. And we haven't captured yet. We've talked about it not just with this council, but other councils have talked about trying to get a handle on exactly what project staff are actually spending their time on. So I would like to know, I think Mr. Saunders put it very well when he said, you know, what's the cost of a pothole? But to really get an idea of where we're expending our staff time, because that's our single biggest expenditure is for the people that are associated with the work levels of the community. So we set the work levels and we kind of are going on, you know, we were happy or we weren't happy with last year, so more of that or less of that. But I would really like to tie that to some better accounting practices. I'd like to see that be something that we look at in conjunction with our asset management. We'll have to look at our people management.
Great. Mayor Hamilton? No, you're good. Anyone else? Councillor Martin?
Thank you. I'm only bringing this up because our Director of Finance did mention it in his preamble. I'm fine with the timelines for 2018. but I certainly would not be content with these for 2019. My goal would be that I circled it. You have November 28th as the management meeting budget kickoff. That's when I actually would like the budget to be done, not when we're starting it. So I think we need to have a budget for 2019 at the beginning of 2019, not in March, April, or May of 2019. At least that's my opinion when it comes to that. And the only reason I bring that up is because you mentioned it. But the dates within this category is fine. If you're asking me questions that's, for example, on the screen right now, I struggle with that. I mean, I don't think I need to go over the asset management issues that we've already discussed, but the reality is we're dealing with several stressors. So, for example, we have a 1.6 inflation rate. We have a QP agreement that's already in place that's over inflation. We have a the GVPL stress is going to come in at 2.9%. West Shore Park and Rec is going to come in at 4.7% lift. I don't know what RCMP and what CREST is, so it's easy for me to say, listen, I would love for us to stay at the rate of inflation. I don't think we should be increasing past the rate of inflation, and that makes common sense because that's keeping us equal, and you know we have those things. But we have outside organizations that we're part of that are much above 1.6. So when you ask for me what I would like that to be, it's hard to give that type of advice until I see all those numbers that are coming in from those outside organizations. Excluding that, I mean, obviously we need to keep our tax rate, I think, at a minimum at the present time. I know we're going to be discussing, for example, what this council's priorities are. Is it infrastructure? Is it sidewalks? Is it roads? What is it? And if we're serious about that, then we need to have those discussions about, are we willing to pay for those? Or do we have an expectation that developers are paying those? And if we are expecting developers to pay those, that rolls right back into our OCP, and how does our OCP fit? I mean, I'm struggling right now with our OCP because I hear stressors constantly about we need to increase densification. We need to maximize what we can, but whenever we do that, the neighboring or the neighbors that touch any new development always push back to a level of, no, they don't want to see higher density in their neighborhood. They're fine with higher density in somebody else's neighborhood, but not in theirs. So I'm still struggling from an OCP standpoint to understand if this community truly wants increased density or if they are actually content with single-family homes. And if we are content with single-family homes, we have to look at how do we meet those other goals of infrastructure and so on. And that's going to have to be done one way or the other. So that's where I'm coming from right now. Thank you.
Councillor Knoll?
Yes, I would have to agree with Councillor Martin on the budget timing. That's something I have been pushing for since the very first time I got elected, to have a budget that's not in place until May, when your fiscal year starts in January, seems foolhardy. We could at least have Colwood's part all prepared in November, and then we would know what we were going to do starting January 1st. As it stands, we've got dozens of projects that are carrying over from 2017, probably because we didn't start them till May. So you get in a vicious circle of doing that. And the second thing I would have to say is I agree with Councillor Martin on the OCP comments. Everybody wants better transit service, more rec centers, more police, but they don't want more density in their neighborhood. Well, you have to weigh the two. I mean, you can't get one without the other unless you push your tax rate through the roof. So it's going to be a delicate balancing act as we bring the OCP back to this committee and to the public committee and public comments and bring it to a bylaw stage, exactly how we manage that density. I'm not happy at all with the OCP the way it's written on the densification. It's got to have far more specific rules on where we will allow extra density and how we're going to transition from single-family neighborhoods to higher density neighborhoods. Those aren't in the OCP right now. Goldstream is written as a densification corridor because it's a transit corridor, but it doesn't have sewers. Or sorry, Kelly Road. How do you densify where there are no sewers? Good question. So there's a lot of work to be done yet, and I am eagerly awaiting this committee's comments and further public input on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Day?
Sure, just a quick question. There's also an Appendix B. Are we going to discuss that separately? The projects list, 2017 projects?
Yep.
We are.
Yep.
Okay, then I will save my questions for then.
Okay, so we'll wrap up this discussion, and then Councillor Chong?
Great, thank you through the chair. Just to put in my 2 cents. On the questions before us, tax rate limitations, I don't think anyone wants higher tax rates, and I think this council has been doing a great job in trying to keep that at a minimum as best as we can. I think staff have done a great job, and council, to try and get the city on a good financial foothold. And looking from our citizen survey that we just completed, I see that the public is pretty happy with the services we currently put out. And so I would say that, we should maintain that, try to keep things at a low cost and not put out new services. I think the asset management alone is enough to kind of scare us. We have no idea what we're going to be hit with, and I think we should be extremely cautious going forward with that. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. From what I'm hearing is that a committee isn't necessarily able to identify a specific rate increase until they see the numbers, to see what pressures we're going to be facing based on wage increases and inflationary increases. So I expect you'll probably, once we find those numbers before us, we'll have a better idea on what to advise. I'll jump to the new tax revenue, and when I look at the citizen survey, the one thing that the residents told us is that they're happy with a heck of a lot of stuff that's happening here. However, our shortfall is the provision of sidewalks and that type of infrastructure. So the one thing that's always bugged me through our budget cycles is that the residents don't really benefit from new growth and the new revenue that's generated. So as a result of that new growth. So my preference is that, and I don't know what the percentage would be, but I would sure love to see a percentage of that new tax revenue earmarked for stuff like sidewalks, some of the good infrastructure that we need to build, but residents can certainly benefit from as a result of new development. So something that's tangible that existing residents can utilize. Again, I don't know what the percentage is, but certainly something that can be earmarked and built on year over year would be helpful. So with that, I'll go to Jen to go over Appendix B.
Thank you. So Appendix B, this is an update on the information that we presented at the third quarter. So what you see before you is a summary of all of the city's projects that were budgeted for the 2017 year. And the 2017 year-end figures, those are projections. So we've taken our known year-to-date actual costs, and then we've also estimated out projections based on existing contracts and commitments and unprocessed invoices. So some projects to highlight that are in progress and that will carry forward into next year. Asset management implementation, the somewhat minor costs that you do see there, those are related to the onboarding fees under our new agreement with the CRD for their GIS mapping services. And moving into 2018, we will be putting together a plan to speak to the continued implementation work. And as our city engineer mentioned, this won't be a single year project. This is going to be ongoing. But we do acknowledge that the implementation work itself, there will be additional associated costs with that, and we will have updated information to speak to that project in the new year as we get started on the 2018 budget. We also do have a number of bylaws that are either being updated or created, and those are in progress. Our subdivision development bylaw, new DCC bylaw, our official community plan, as you're well aware. That work is in progress. Our coastline erosion study, that is also in progress. And with respect to our capital projects, we are projecting to incur costs of approximately $4 million on a $5 million budget. And some of the projects that are in progress, transportation improvements on Machosen Road related to creation of bike lanes between Souk and Wishart. One of the projects related to the Ocean Boulevard pump station, and we will be continuing to look at the scope of that project, but we are in progress on some of the protection work. And then the biggest project that was on our books this year was the Central Sewer expansion. That project is substantially complete, but we are still finalizing the final costs. It does look like that project will come in under budget, but we'll have a better idea in the new year. And that is more or less an update on our projects. I'm happy to answer any specific questions.
Great. Thank you. I will open this part up to the public because we didn't have a chance to comment on the projects before we bring it back to committee. Rick?
I want to beat a dead horse here. And I realize the staff are working as hard as they can. The only point I want to make is that I understand it's going to be a recurring process for asset management. That's inevitable because as you're developing new areas of the city, you're going to bring on board more and more or additional assets to have to care for over the course of the year. My only concern is if you don't put a line in the sand and say, we'll have our first draft of this thing by such and such a date, we're going to be here a year from now, and we're going to have the same conversation. And maybe I'm being pessimistic, but that's the feeling I have right now. And I hope we don't have the same conversation next year at this time. Thank you.
Fair comment. Thank you. Okay. Committee? Councillor Day?
Thank you. I noted that there's quite a few projects that are listed as their final amount being exactly the same, like to the penny, as their projected amount. Are some of these estimates of what you've spent?
Yes, so just to clarify, the 2017 year-end figure, these are estimated projections in some cases. And so what that means is we're taking what has actually been incurred to date, and then estimates are being put in place for unprocessed invoices or amounts committed under existing contracts. So there are a couple of projects that the estimate, for example, our generator, we've put it right in at $130,000. We are expecting it to come in close to that amount. And I should add that we will be going through, again, the 2017 variances at the first February proposed committee of the whole meeting, and that is when we expect to know about 99% accuracy what our final actual costs are on these projects.
Thank you.
Through the chair, if I may, I'll speak to one of them because I think it might help with the picture. For example, transportation improvements, the crosswalk at Veterans Memorial Parkway. As Councillor Day rightly pointed out, it indicates that we'll be spending all of the $150,000. This one is an interesting one, and and I'm glad that Councillor Day has brought this up. The actual cost for that project, as you see it, is actually more than $150,000 because we combined some maintenance, some significant maintenance into that project as well. So the $150,000, yes, we spent it of capital funds, and 100% of that will be expended. But that actual project probably at the end of the day will come in at around $172,000 because the remainder of it was processed with a maintenance project that we were going to undertake there.
Thank you.
If I could, there's just I just have another comment to make. There are, I think I counted 9 items which are being deferred to 2018, and I would say the majority of them are also being suggested to be included in the core operating budget. So my question is, with regard to the core operating budget, seems to be the area where I, as a councillor, have the most difficulty scrutinizing it to ensure that it meets our expectations from year to year. So when we have a special project budget that comes forward, it's proposed to us, we know exactly what's going to be accomplished, we have some pretty good estimates usually involved, and then we can follow up on that throughout the rest of the year. Once it slides over into the core operating area, that becomes a lot more difficult for me as a councillor trying to do my due diligence to follow up on what happens with it. So, for example, the transportation improvements are being suggested to be part of the ongoing capital maintenance operating budget. And I mean, that's a small item, but I'm just trying to understand, once it slides over into core, what can we do to gain a better understanding of what the pressures are and what the benefits are that go with those projects?
Jen or Chris?
I'll just speak a bit to it, and if Jen has something to add, that would be great. One thing I mentioned about this intention to move to service level budgeting is that it provides that level of that ability for scrutiny, because it actually identifies the services within that core budget that are being provided. So rather than just saying that engineering services as a department is costing the city $1 million, I don't know what that does. You've got a line item for transportation services in there that you can scrutinize on a line-by-line basis. So just because it would be rolled into the core doesn't mean that we can't maintain a level of accountability to the public and to council. Rather, it's just identified as something that has been established as a service level that the community expects to continue. And if it's expected to continue, why are we asking ourselves if we should continue that every single year by putting it into a capital budget?
Jen?
Just to add, some of these items that were identified as projects, it's tied to asset management, in that this is ongoing maintenance work related to our existing infrastructure. So it really is more appropriately defined as being a core operating expense for the city, rather than being identified as a capital project. And in some cases, if it is an improvement or a betterment, then maybe we are going to look at it independently as a capital project. But many of these items, which we have commented on, it's ongoing maintenance work relating to existing assets. And so the intention is to move that type of work over into our core budget.
Councillor Martin?
Thank you. I guess I will just make more of a comment than it is a question. And the comment is, so I basically circled, I think there's 5 or 6 projects that basically there's a $0 spent so far. And from a philosophical standpoint, at least from a council standpoint, my opinion is that when we fund a project, that's basically giving instruction to staff that we want that accomplished. So when I see 5 or 6 things that aren't, not even $1 being spent, it basically is saying staff either didn't have the time, or that it wasn't a priority, or there's something. So there's a message behind why there isn't anything being spent. And that makes me feel very uncomfortable, because it should come back to either well, it's going to come back to this group now instead of TPI, but we used to get updates through transportation and infrastructure. And where were we at? How long was the project? And where was it moving to? There's a couple of these that they're really sort of philosophical decisions that they're being postponed for some reasons, and then there's other reasons. For example, we just haven't written an RFP for it yet. Yeah, and that one's, for example, the transportation improvements on the third page, where it basically says a project's been deferred to 2018 and RFP will need to be undertaken. So it's a matter of us being realistic when we build out this budget, that I really do not want to have items on our budget if our staff truly don't believe it's accomplishable in that year, in that fiscal year. So I guess that's just my challenge back to staff, and is to be realistic around your time. I understand that there's lots of stresses and sometimes you just can't get things done, and I'm not expecting us to be 100% complete, but there is sort of that direction from council that when we fund something, we're expecting it to get accomplished. And that's sort of our way of saying do it. So that's just where I'm feeling about it. So, you know, I'll talk offline about some of these things, but that's just sort of a general broad statement that I'd like to make.
Yeah, and I think you really highlight a comment that Councillor Nault made in terms of getting the budget to us and approved earlier, so staff can actually have a full 12 months to get some of this stuff done. But I will point out, I mean, staff have done a hell of a job in completing a lot of these tasks, which have been on the books for a long time, like the VMP crossing and that sort of jazz. So I think now that those large projects are off the books, it certainly will give staff, because your point's well taken, but I think that'll give staff some breathing room to move on. And then if we do our part in terms of getting the budget approved sooner, I think it'll accomplish all our goals, and staff will be like, oh, thank God I've got like 3 or 4 extra months to get some stuff done. Because I know it's a frustration for them too. So that's a good point. Anything else on this subject? Councillor Day?
Thank you. I just have one more question, and if staff don't have the answer tonight, that's fine, because it may take some figuring to figure out. But just through our discussion and thinking about the difference between our special projects and our core work, I'm wondering, what will the dollar increase to the core be with the addition of all of these capital projects that are now being slid over? Well, maybe always belong there. I mean, I'm not suggesting that anybody's doing anything they shouldn't do. I just mean that because we're acknowledging that, sidewalks are going to be built every year, street lights are going to be changed every year, capital asset planning will happen every year. That is going to change our description of our budget quite a bit, I would think.
Jen?
On that note, I will add, similar with how the core budget was first introduced under last year's budgeting process, those are some of the factors that we absolutely speak to. So some of our service areas are becoming, newly defined. We now have separate IT department position in a sense, so that core budget is building, and every year we are refining our process. So when we bring forward the draft 2018 to 2022 financial plan, and we start to speak about here's where core is at, we will highlight the factors as to why it is sitting where it is and explain why the variance is where it is, and movement of items, that may have been considered a capital project when truly it is ongoing maintenance work. That will absolutely be one of the factors that we will highlight.
Thank you. Seeing no further speakers, there is a recommendation presented to us from staff. I'm looking for a motion.
Is that this?
Yes.
The 2018.
So the recommendation is that the 2018 to 2022 budget financial planning approach be endorsed.
So moved.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? It's carried. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is a presentation from the Director of Planning and our planner regarding the draft official community plan policies. So, do you need a minute? Okay. Turn it over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, we're looking at tonight and the next three Committee of the Whole meeting is there's an opportunity for staff to provide some educational opportunities to the public and council about the new official community plan. So we are going to be going over a lot of stuff that's been presented at previous events. So apologies to folks. I'm just looking at the crowd. I think most of the attendees tonight have been at some stage at a presentation where we went over this stuff. So I'm going to go through the first part pretty quickly. That's the land use designations. I think most of council heard from our lead consultant, Jennifer Fix, at the council workshop and then through the steering committee meetings. I'm just going to so quickly go through that. Then Catherine Lasician, our planner, is going to be going through the policies in the OCP. So please, by all means, if council has questions, you can interrupt, won't be offended. And then at the end, there'll obviously be opportunity for the public to ask questions. So, making waves. So that's what we called this project, Making Waves. And we've certainly made some waves with the release of the draft. It was as of November 9th, and that's what the focus of tonight's presentation is. So we're currently in phase 3 of a 3-phase process that began just over a year ago. Phase 1 included extensive visioning to understand the community, values, and priorities. It also included speakers nights, an online survey, ideas fair, mobile booth situated around the town, workshops with staff and council. And I can't say enough about the good work of staff, in particular our communications manager. In terms of a planning process, this has been the best for public engagement that I've been involved in my career. So hats off to the team for that. So for an update on engagement, we had a really good event that dovetailed with the Christmas light up. I think, Catherine, we probably had 60-ish people that came through, and a very engaged group to talk to us about the draft OCP. And I want to say thanks to folks that have made submissions in terms of feedback on the OCP. We've really received a lot of really, really good ideas for improvements of the draft, and keep it coming. There's lots of opportunity to keep providing input. So once again, I'm going to go pretty quickly because I think most people have heard extensively on these points. So when we did the engagement, we heard some themes came through quite strongly. The first was that people identified as Cotw Corners as the heart of the community, and the waterfront was the soul. So you've heard that before, probably from our consultants, and we tried to really reflect that in the draft. That instead of really having that town center as the main center, we're now proposing 2 centers on a equal playing field. We also heard that streets should be for people, that the community wants transportation choices, and that people want gathering places and places to go. So high quality public spaces. And lastly, that Colwood wants to continue to be a family friendly community and to provide housing choices to newcomers. So next, get into the land use policies. I'm going to be talking about the land use policies once again pretty quick, and I'll pass it over to Catherine, who's going to be getting into the policy and objectives that flow beyond our different designations. So this map is what we're calling the land use designation map in the draft OCP. It defines intended growth areas and controlled growth areas. So we're going to start with the intended growth areas. And we've heard loud and clear from the community that this map needs to have a bit of work. There's some areas, both in this map and other maps, that can be made a little bit more accurate. And then also we've heard that the green that's shown, which is meant to indicate open space, should be split between Colwood Park and open space and private open space. So we're looking at that modification in draft 2. So Colwood Corners. So this is intended to be one of the 2 primary centers for cultural, civic, and economic and public life within the city. The center is meant to be a local, citywide, and regional destination. So what we're talking about is really a downsizing of what's currently called the town center. It's being recast as something that's more in line with what we see as likely development in the next 10, 20 years. But continue to be the major focus of future residential and commercial growth that's feeding off of the real asset for this area of Colwood, which is its transportation links. So Souk Road, Goldstream, and the location as part of the what BC Transit is proposing to be a rapid transit corridor. So this area is, in terms of built form, is expected to be a mix of low and mid-rise and potentially some higher-rise buildings up to what we're proposing, 15 stories. So next is the other primary center, the Seaside Village. So this is the Royal Bay waterfront. Once again, would be a center for civic, economic, and public life within the city. We heard loud and clear from the public that we really need to take full advantage of the opportunities of the waterfront. It's an opportunity for Colwood to become a really unique destination on the West Coast. And we're proposing that through that feedback, some high expectations are set for that area. So in terms of built form, we're talking in this proposal low to mid-rise buildings up to 12 stories. But once again, maintaining a high pedestrian amenities, walking connections, and high-quality open space along the water. So we're also proposing rationalization of current potential infill around neighborhood centers. So those are the orange circles that most people have probably heard about in our presentations. So this is where we would direct small-scale neighborhood serving new development, so mixed-use centers, creating gathering places and destinations such as cafes, groceries, and shops. And it's all trying to put together a pedestrian-friendly community. So we're talking here densities of up to 4 stories at the center of the nodes. And the only new one in this plan that's being proposed is at the intersection of Lagoon Road and Machosen Roads. So next is the transit growth corridors. So this is a new land use designation. So it's the blue lines that follow the arterial roads at the northern end of the municipality. This is intended to be the recipient of more density to support transit development and increase the proportion of residents that live close to transit routes. So the densities here are meant to go up to 3-4 story kind of stacked townhouse built form. And in terms of the thinking behind where these areas for infill are to be located, it's a little difficult to see at this scale, but these maps are meant to address questions from the public about how far, in terms of real travel distance, so that'd be how far it would take to walk existing road and trail networks to get between both the transit density corridors and the neighborhood centers. So apologies, I can see it's a little difficult to see, but it's basically showing that significant portions of the municipality would fall within those designations based on real travel distance. And we're right now trying to find a way to address comments and concerns about how that would be manifested in the densities.
Councillor Day just had a quick question.
Just wondering if you had a page number for your OCP book for those maps so that people could refer to them. They may have their OCPs. If not here, they might have them at home and they could have a closer look later.
Through the chair, these maps were actually developed about a week ago in response to comments from our first steering committee. Yeah. We're working on maps, so the consultant's putting these together. We're working on maps that these are meant to show the location of dwellings that would be 200 and 400 meters. So the 200 meters is in the green dots that are hard to see, and the within 400 meters real travel distance is the blue dot. So we're working with them to get maps that would show the actual parcels of land that would fall under those two radii, as opposed to just the dots. So that brings us to our neighborhood designation. So these is a designation meant to encompass mostly existing neighborhoods. And this, we're moving into the controlled growth areas. We heard from the community loud and clear, existing neighborhood areas are meant to, they want them to have the family-oriented, the single-family orientation maintained. We're proposing that we're drawing back from the neighborhood areas relative to the 2008 plan that would allow for densification along general corridors. So that's pretty much any arterial road that connects planned or existing nodes. What we're saying is to really try to concentrate that at the neighborhood centers and the other seaside and Cotw corners, so we're not pulling the string at both ends in terms of trying to locate density. So we're proposing in this area that all development would be ground orientated. So that would mean a front door at the street or at least on the ground, and provide some moderate infill potential for detached homes, duplexes, townhouses, secondary suites, and coach houses. So this image is trying to depict a single-family home with a coach house integrated into the backyard. So lastly, I just want to touch on the hillside and shoreline, which is a designation that is that buff color that encompasses quite a bit of the community. So this is in our existing OCP, and it's meant to encompass established neighborhoods and new areas. They're located mostly in large greenfield sites. The difference here is that we heard from the public that protecting natural features is very important, and the continuation of this designation would be in support of that. So lower densities in support of protecting natural features such as trees and rocky outcrops, and then further protecting ecological features such as shorelines and riparian areas. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Catherine, who is helping manage this project. Thanks.
Thank you. One of the major ways to achieve protection and preservation of hillsides and shorelines is through site adaptive planning, which is a key focus in this draft official community plan, where sites are developed with natural assets and natural infrastructure in mind. This slide reviews some of the ways in which we can approach site adaptive design. So the first step is to require a natural assets inventory. That's where we look at the rocky outcrops, significant trees, steep slopes, ridge lines. This helps staff to determine what part of the site will be kept intact and what parts can be developed. We also need to consider solar access and pedestrian connections through the properties. And then the
The fourth picture illustrates a site-adaptive design that weaves buildings into the landscape while preserving most of the site's natural character. So moving on to transportation policies is the discussion about how we use our streets and how we get around. This draft OCP recognizes that cars aren't going anywhere anytime soon, but the focus is rather on giving people options to have the ability to cycle or walk rather than take their car for some of the trips. When we talk about how best to get people moving in and around the city, we need to talk about our road network, but we also need to talk about providing practical improvements so that people have options. In terms of physical improvements to the transportation network, the vision is for an expanded sidewalk network that fills in gaps, prioritizing mixed-use centers, schools, and transit corridors. It's also a goal to create beautiful and pedestrian-scaled areas that include active storefronts along the ground floor, uses that spill into pedestrian areas such as cafes, minimal building setbacks, and complementary pedestrian amenities such as seating, signage, and lighting. In order to support transit viability, we have to coordinate land use in support of our transit network, focusing growth in and around Colwood Corners, as well as along our transit corridor in and around Souk Road. We can also look at improving transit stop amenities and infrastructure. So housing is a challenging topic for local governments to tackle because housing costs are market-driven. And while Colwood is relatively affordable, it still struggles with affordability. In July of this year, the average cost of a single detached house was over $660,000, an increase of over $110,000 from the previous year. Regionally, the vacancy rate is well below healthy, sitting at around 0.7%. Currently in Colwood, the community housing makeup is 51% single detached housing, 38% duplexes and row housing, and just 11% apartment or condo. So while housing issues often fall within jurisdiction of senior levels of government, the housing policies in this OCP focus on land use and other tools available to local governments to support a mix of housing. So first, we want to increase housing choices for existing and future residents, taking into consideration household sizes, incomes, tenures, needs, and preferences. We want to encourage family-friendly and accessible housing, which includes ground floor units and outdoor amenity space. We want distributed housing choices, and we want to allow secondary suites, including the option for coach housing. We also encourage rental housing and a range of non-market housing options by offering incentives and co-locating non-market, rental, and special needs housing with transit and other amenities to support accessibility. So Section 10 of the OCP focuses on climate change. This covers both mitigation, so preventing climate change by reducing GHGs, and adaptation, preparing for and adapting to the impacts of climate change, which in this region will include warmer winters, hotter and drier summers, and overall more extreme weather events. On the mitigation side, the largest contributor to Colwood's GHGs is the transportation sector. As such, the transportation and land use policies in this OCP do most of the work on the GHG side of things. However, this OCP also recommends the development of a green building strategy that sets incremental performance steps for new buildings to transition from the BC Building Code to net zero ready buildings over a period of time. On the adaptation side, there's many parks and natural area policies that provide direction to improve green areas and protect trees, which act as natural sinks to absorb GHGs. We can also focus attention on understanding specific vulnerabilities for Colwood as a result of climate change. And we can work on improving resilience of shorelines and applying green shore setbacks. This has been the top priority of residents time and time again. Trees, topography, oceanfront, and natural areas are a defining and cherished quality of Colwood. One major objective is to protect, restore, and enhance these spaces. Often when we think about infrastructure, we think of pipes, roads, sewers, the gray stuff. What this OCP is seeking to do is to also place value on the green stuff, the natural assets that provide the free services of nature to manage our resources. For example, integrated rainwater management is a prominent feature in this OCP, including minimization of impervious surfaces so that rainwater can infiltrate the ground. Require developments to include rain gardens and bioswales to naturally manage stormwater, to maintain trees and vegetation to manage the heat island effect, and to help with cooling. This OCP also focuses on a holistic and life cycle approach to asset management, in which the full costs of development are considered in decision making. One of the big changes proposed in this OCP is that all new development will be connected to sewer. Arts, culture, and heritage plays an important role in creating a sense of place. Colwood intends to continue to strengthen relationships and seek partnership opportunities with First Nation neighbors for mutual benefit. We will continue to support and reinforce cultural inclusivity and involvement, and the OCP lends general support to the arts and culture sector by providing adequate spaces for formal and informal public art in buildings, streets, and parks, and supporting the establishment of an arts and culture center that would build on the strengths of the West Shore Parks and Rec Society. When we talk about food systems, we need to think of the entire food cycle, including production, processing, distribution, celebration, and nutrient recovery. Production can be supported through community gardens in public and private realms, allotment gardens in private developments, edible landscaping, beehives, and continued protection of ALR lands. Support establishment of community processing facilities such as community kitchens, as well as private processing facilities such as microbreweries, distilleries, and other value-added commercial uses. Encourage food retail, including grocery stores, restaurants, cafes, pubs. And then in terms of nutrient recovery, work with the CRD to support appropriate disposal, recovery, and reuse of organic material. The final section in the policy part of the OCP is about our local economy. The city has an economic development strategy in place. Some of the challenges addressed in the strategy relate directly to land use and transportation. Included in that is concern about growing levels of traffic congestion and the absence of a vibrant waterfront or downtown. In addition to the land use and transportation policies in the OCP, this section supports the relocation of City Hall to one of the centers to help energize and activate the area, provide gateway and wayfinding signage in and around Colwood, and maintain support for home occupations in all neighborhoods across Colwood, while protecting against disturbance to neighbors.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. So I'm just going to conclude with a brief talk about next steps. So we heard loud and clear from the community they don't want this step rushed. So we're looking at coming back with a draft and a accounting of all the changes based on community input that we're receiving right now. So we hope to have very soon in the new year that work completed for the community and council's review and potential readings of an associated bylaw. So the next committee of the whole meeting, we're looking to follow up on this presentation with a description and discussion on action items. So you see throughout the draft, there's bubbles that highlight the action items that are associated with policies and objectives. And that was very intentional. The 2008 OCP had a lot of really good ideas about changes. Unfortunately, just a fraction of them were actually made. So the idea being if we can get those action items really realistically crafted and brought right into the text, it will be very difficult for us not to be able to go back and remind ourselves of what we said we were going to do. And easy for council to keep staff to account as well. So we're looking to go through that at the next committee of the whole meeting. And then following up on that, depending where we're at with our community consultation and revisions, we'll be looking at a review of that work to get to a second draft, and then also to talk about the game changers. So there's a few things in this draft's OCP that really are calling for big shifts in thinking in Colwood and development patterns and the way that we address change. And we don't want to shy away from that and make sure that council and the public's aware. So we're thinking for the third committee of the whole in this series to discuss that. With that, I'll just say thank you to council for this opportunity. It's been an amazing 12, 14 months, and it just is. It's a fantastic opportunity for us in planning to get this work done. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Ian, for your presentation. With that, we will open it up to the public for any feedback or questions you might have for staff. This is not typically a shy bunch, looking at the individuals that are in the audience. Okay, perfect. We'll just need your name and address for the record, please.
Ashley Benera, 304 Daniel Place. Just a question. I wrote about the OCP and about my husband and my concerns about their Machosen and Lagoon Road being a new neighborhood center. It's not what we would wish for, but I never heard back. So I'm just hoping for future people who write to that email address, maybe just a quick, like, we got your email and just an acknowledgement of it. I don't know who's in charge of that, but I think that would be helpful from people writing in standpoint. And just want to go on the record that I know, Councillor Martin, you said people maybe only fight the battles that are in their own neighborhoods, but being someone who's on Daniel Place and having to fight that battle, it's emotionally draining. So I think that fighting all the battles about where, you know, the higher density is going to go is just too hard for us to do. So we picked the one that's closest to home. So I would like to say that everyone that I speak to who lives in Colwood likes the small community feel, and I'd just like to go on record, we'd like it to stay that way. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Oh, Michael.
I just wanted to point out that Christmas is coming, and I don't think there's a lot of people in the community willing to be focused on this right now. And I hope that the second draft will not be prepared too soon in the new year to give people time to get Christmas over with, wake up and, you know, take a bit more interest in the OCP. I mean, obviously you don't want to give extraordinary amounts of time for that. People are either going to be interested or they're not. This is not a very good season for it. And I just wanted to add my comment on the Lagoon Machosen Neighborhood Center, which already exists, and I love it, and I hope we'll gently expand it. Thank you.
Great. How come you're not wearing a Christmas tie, Michael? We're used to that.
Yes, I don't get a lot of chances to wear ties anymore.
Thank you. Rick?
It's based on previous comments. Yeah, Richard Marchand, 3508 Aloha Avenue. I think you've got it written down somewhere. Ian, with respect to the next steps, there's a good point that was just raised in terms of, I'm sure you've received multiple emails with plenty of recommendations, constructive criticisms, additions, deletions, et cetera, How or what is the plan? How are we going to address that, other than forcing people to take their comments and go back line item by line item personally to see whether or not they were captured or not? Is there a means by which we're going to try and bring this all together and get everybody's comments listed out and agreed, not agreed? We modified the text, but not the way you wanted it, because there were several people commenting on the same thing. I know there's more art than science in drafting these kinds of documents, but I know, based on my NATO experiences, if you don't take some sort of an effort like this, people's backs will get up, and then they'll consider that their comments weren't taken into consideration. So I guess it's a bit of a skill testing question, not that we need an answer right now, but is it part of the process? I guess that's the only thing I can ask.
Ian?
Mr. Chair, certainly we've committed to make sure that the any future drafts will have a clear accounting of what's changed. We're also going to be putting together a summary. There'll be a cutoff point for the summary in terms of public input, and try to get those emergent themes really front and center of that summary. It's good food for thought in terms of ideas about how to address comments that are being made. We are blessed with a real overflowing of comments from a really engaged community. So whether we're going to be, I don't think we'll be able to address every piece of communication we receive, but we're going to try to pull out the themes in a summary, and also do justice to the work that people have done to give us comments.
Thank you. Anyone else before I bring it back to committee?
My name is Aurora Matters. I'm of 364 Maywell Place. I also submitted feedback about the neighborhood center at Machosen and Lagoon, and I had a question in regards to what it means for someone who now lives within the latest map version and within 200 meters. So I'd like to know what policy I fall under, because in the map, in the OCP, I'm shoreline hillside, and in the latest map that has the dots, I'm 200. So I think a lot of people who live within that area would be interested to know what that means for them, if there is a change into zoning or what their neighbor could do. Just be interested to have an answer. So I also didn't get a response. I sent it fairly recently, but just wondering if maybe someone could speak to that. And if there is a change, are you planning on letting the people within those dots know what that means for them, much like a rezoning application would have? Thank you.
Question. Thank you. Ian?
Hey, Mr. Chair. Once again, thank you for making the comments. It's actually, I think, your letter that the letter that was referenced that got us thinking about there's an area of overlap between hillside and shoreline and that 200-meter watershed. So we're looking at that specific area right now and how to, better address the seemingly a contradiction for having a hillside and shoreline designation within that potential neighborhood center area. In terms of responses, I think that staff, we need to do a better job of getting back to people quickly, but it's a function of how much input we've received. So what I'll be doing tomorrow is directing our frontline staff to be providing responses as it's received. What we've been trying to do is take input and then either Catherine or myself address things as they're received, and just the sheer volume, I think, is slowing that down. So we'll try to get that tightened up.
Yeah, and I'm just hearing they're not looking for, folks aren't looking for a detailed response. It's just like, yep, got it, perfect, and yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. I'm sorry? Okay.
And as I said, we're trying to address things as quickly as we can. It's just we are our cup runneth over with good comments.
It's not a bad thing. No. Carol, yeah.
Through you, Chair, just a question to the public that are concerned about the emails. Are you sending them directly into a specific staff member, not that we need to know who, or the info at Colwood? Because okay, that's great, because sometimes the info one gets a bit bogged down because that's a general sense one, and it has to kind of be weeded through and then resent. So I just wanted to be sure you're targeting the right place.
Anyone else before I bring it to committee?
Laurie Ingalls, 3347 Hatley Drive. I too had forwarded some correspondence to planning, and I just really wanted to make a general comment that sort of summarizes what that communication was. And it was just basically that both my wife and I had a concern with the OCP as it sits right now with respect to the lack of emphasis on the economy in the city. The fact that the economy received less ink than food systems I found, kind of telling. And I really think that some emphasis on what we can do as a community to improve the economy, to create jobs so that people can live, work, and play in Colwood is something that I'd like to see in the OCP. And, I realize that we're not magicians, and that it's sometimes difficult to come up with tangibles in terms of like, what can you do to improve the economy of Colwood? But I do think that, as I mentioned in my communication, that some of the neighboring communities have done an amazing job of, building their economy, making it a vibrant center. And that, I think, is missing in the OCP right now. And I'm hoping that the next draft will address that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ben.
Hi, it's Ben Mycroft, 300 Latoria Boulevard. I'm with Royal Bay. I just wanted to quickly say, overall, great document. Obviously, there's a huge amount of work that's gone into that from the consultant as well as planning staff, and it's probably the one time or one of the few times you'll appreciate what it feels like to be a developer, having to pitch a plan. And like I said, overall, a great document. We are concerned. I'm probably about 30 hours into reading the 250-page document. It's very detailed. Just a few brief comments. There's about 134 pages of development permit guidelines, up from about 57 or so. So just, that metric, maybe there's different font sizes and more pictures, but overall, we do feel like there are quite a few more regulations added. We've been completing a detailed review. We're at about a 20-page letter so far, with comments both, constructive or, in many cases, there's great ideas. Sometimes they're conflicting with other policies. There is a lot of very specific policy in there that deserves a lot of specific attention. And, reviewing it in a PowerPoint presentation and some conversation is great, but I think that a lot more in-depth analysis needs to be done, and engagement with the community and special interests in the community, such as the development community. Otherwise, there's some unintended risks that, a year from now, planning staff are going to tell us that they're caught between a rock and a hard place because the policy in the OCP can't be interpreted any other way. And we've come up against that ourselves at Royal Bay, most recently with the Latoria North zoning. And so we just, no specific criticisms. We just urge that enough time be taken to make sure you get it right. And that we'd like to be part of the conversation to make sure that it is headed in the right direction. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Ben. Dave.
Mayor, council staff, Dave Saunders, 813 Paris Road. Again, property owner in Colwood. I'm hearing from the development community and stakeholders, for whatever reason, they're phoning me because of the OCP. And I know staff have done an incredible workload on it, and Sandra has done an incredible job of communication. However, as I mentioned in the last meeting, there is a bit of a disconnect, and I think in speaking with a majority of the developers, they'd like to see some sort of liaison kind of type structure with staff and members of council. I know that once you have 3 members of council, it's deemed a quorum, so you can only have 2, but they would like that conversation to take place so they can actually have that realization of what their needs are in relation to today's economy, and how do you produce an affordable house. In my opinion, an affordable house isn't $600,000 or $700,000. I know my daughters can't afford that. But if you lump on 126 more standard hardcore policies, I know the cost of that will go up. But I do know that the ear of the developer is willing to work with you and listen to your suggestions, and I see a liaison type structure. It may be a little bit slower, however, I think at the end of the day you'll get a better product. With reference to the asset management plan that we talked about, and with reference to the economy that the citizen talked about, asset management is very important, and everybody spoke to it. I feel that land use tax planning from a tax-based management plan is just as important. In consideration, I've just done a few quick figures of a loss of basically 14 stories in our town center just by downzoning it to 15 in a combination of 5 buildings. If you took 5 structures or 5 floors, so 5 units, 580,000, that's very low at a view type condo unit, equating to $2.9 million times 14. It's just over $40 million of taxable revenue, BCSS tax revenue, just at the stroke of a pen. So in reviewing the document that I've seen and some of the community consultation that I've been part of, there hasn't been those hardcore figures that say density costs this much. Our wish list is this much. What's that balance, and how do we get there? I think that there's something missing that reflects that. I think some of the standards that are in place are too hardcore, and an OCP needs to be flexible and a living, breathing document. And right now, it isn't that flexible. So I think that staff, meetings that I've held with them or had with them, and council, thank you very much, everybody, for meeting me on the side. I haven't met with everybody. I'd like to. But I think that we can come to a good OCP, and I encourage that to take place. The first start with that, bridging that gap in the development community at the last meeting was 95% were quite shocked. So I think that we get there through a liaison committee. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Jim.
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, and staff, and yes, my name is Jim Hartshorn. I live at 2789 Guyton Way in a neighboring community. I haven't been in this building for 12 or 15 years, and it's intriguing to be back here and say what I'm going to say. So, first of all, I was invited to a lunch, which I appreciated your staff had forward with the developer, and maybe some know that I was the president of the Developers Association in Langford for 15 years. And the relationship that we built with staff and council was really important, and it was a big issue, in my opinion, and many others, of how the community has grown and how it's grown with staff and with council. And so I enjoyed the meeting. I enjoyed the opportunity to speak at a table, and Catherine was at our table. And she might have been shocked at me, but I'm pretty blunt. And so the reality is, what I've heard from a number of speakers is that you have a big, big, big change, huge change, in my opinion. Site adaptive planning is a great term. Boy, it's got a lot of issues attached to it, including especially money. So my encouragement is, and I've heard it already, and it sounds like I'm encouraged by what Ian said about your next planning, at least 1 or 2 more committee meetings. I would encourage you to have more consultation with the development industry. They're the ones who will actually pay for it. The public will buy their product, we hope, if in this community, any other community. But if they don't do the development, then obviously what you're dreaming about just won't happen. So I encourage more participation in that, and I know you've engaged the community and the taxpayers. That's all part of the process. OCPs are great. I've been involved with a number of them in a number of different communities, and they're a great process, but the results have to be creative enough to be usable and developable and actually build them, if that's in my opinion. So my encouragement is to keep going, keep looking at it, keep getting input, keep refining, and really carefully look at costing, because I'm very, very concerned when I read this document what this is going to do to costing and affordable housing in your community. I think it has a dramatic effect from what I see of it. And with respect, and I noticed the STEP code was brought in. The STEP code, if you listen to Casey Edge from the Victoria Home Builders Association, and he represents all the builders, and frankly, my community, my building experience in the West Shore, we build, my company builds 30-40% of the new houses built in the West Shore. And this is a dramatic change. The STEP code alone is dramatic change in costing. And he passed that on at the luncheon. He was at that meeting. So my encouragement is keep going at it, keep getting input, keep talking, getting feedback, costing it, and then combine it all into a magnificent meeting of approval. Thanks.
We're working towards it. Thanks, Jim.
Hello, my name is Dave Hargraves, 364 Maywell Place. I just had a quick question regarding the neighborhood centers again. The second map that your planning department put out that denotes the 200 and 400 meter markings, what's the significance of that? What's the significance of the 200 meters versus the 400 meters? Is there any at all?
Ian?
Mr. Chair, the significance lies in the so that would be the distance that you would take if you actually use the roads or the trails as opposed to the distance measured as the crow flies. So 200 meters versus 400 meters, those are distances that have been, through research, shown to be distances people are willing to take as opposed to driving their car to things like the corner market or a cafe. So really we're talking about a sort of a 5 to 10 minute walk with those instances. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Not seeing any further folks coming up to the mic. I will bring it back to committee then. Rob.
Thanks. Through the chair, I've got several questions. The first to staff is one of the things that I've been hearing about these neighborhood circles is asking the question why it's a circle and not sort of more oblong, that it actually follows the transit corridor versus going. So, for example, I'll use Lagoon or Lagoon and Metchosin as an example. Within that 200, 400 meters, we're going to hit, I think it's Wickham, behind the Lagoon Market. Whereas it would seem to make more sense that we would want to be building density actually on Metchosin and not behind in a single-family neighborhood that currently exists. So I'm just wondering why we actually picked a circle and didn't more do that sort of stretched out concept.
Mr. Chair, the use of a circle was not meant to be applied literally. It was really just to demarcate the center of the node. In the case of these nodes, they're centered around intersections. So, I think probably this plan would benefit from a description of that use of the symbol. Once again, trying to look at that radius of walking distance as being the basis of it, and that's why the symbol is a circle.
Okay. I guess I'm struggling with it through the chair again. I'm struggling with it just because, it seems that as we try and build out density within our community, it seems to me that the community is more open to density on the main traffic corridors than they are into their local neighborhoods. And so, I think that would cause actually some reduction in stress with a lot of neighbors if they kind of understood that. If we're building it out as a complete circle, then I think we add stress to that. The second question I have for you is we talk about, and staff have spoken about, the need that the community is asking for more affordable housing and some rental units, and in that. But then in the same breath, we sort of talk about building green, and we talk about adaptive planning, and those stressors actually increase cost. So I'm not sure how, and I'm trying to understand, as we try and be more green, as we try to be more adaptive planning, that's going to have additional costs put onto developers, which are eventually passed on to the end consumer. That doesn't sort of encourage affordability, that sort of encourages the opposite. So I'm trying to understand which of these priorities are we overranks the other one. Are we more interested in being green? Are we more interested in being affordable? Are we more interested in rental? How do we, through this OCP, understand, and because sometimes they're completely counter to each other. So how do we do that through this OCP, and how is this sharing those values?
Excellent question, and the reality is we don't have a empirical way to determine what the community exactly says is more important over the other. I'll give an example. The proposal for site adaptive planning is really to address the concerns about the loss of natural features, and then also address the desire to have more amenities that are tied to development. So really trying to do both things through an approach that will add cost to the development of greenfield sites in those hillside or other natural areas. That being said, in this plan we propose to remove development areas from existing environmental development permit areas. So the majority of the brownfield site at Royal Bay, which has very little environmental sensitivities beyond the shoreline and Murray's Pond, we've removed that from the environmental development permit area. So you could argue that that's going to reduce cost potentially. It's a minor reduction, but there won't be the requirement for environmental studies in those areas. So it's not as simple as saying that this is going to increase costs for all development. There's going to be winners and losers in terms of how easy it is to develop sites. And I would say that this is proposing changes that would impact existing areas less than the greenfield sites.
Rob? Thank you. Through the chair. So how do we accomplish affordability then?
The realities of the housing market are that it's really a commodity. Okay, so that the market housing is sold at the price that the market will bear. For a community of Colwood's size, there's very limited opportunities for us to create affordable housing in that dynamic. We do not have a major land base to leverage in terms of public land that we could be using to partner with other nonprofits. We've got very limited resources that are through the good graces of the development community providing amenity contributions to our Attainable Housing Reserve Fund. So as council is aware, we're using that limited resource to support nonprofit housing in the community. But beyond that, there's not a lot that we can do to get the average price of housing down because of that market nature of the industry.
Thank you. One final question. Okay. Different topic. One of the things we talked about was creating more pedestrian-friendly areas. And I'm just curious, outside of Colwood Corners and the Royal Bay development, where else do we anticipate that we could actually create a pedestrian-friendly area within Colwood?
I mean, the hope is, I'm looking over to our Director of Engineering, but our hope is that all of Colwood is as pedestrian friendly as it can be. I would argue that a lot of the existing residential areas, because of their low traffic speeds or low traffic volumes, are relatively pedestrian friendly for neighborhoods that don't have sidewalks. So I think it's a matter of prioritizing areas as has been outlined in this OCP.
Thanks. Jason?
Thank you. I want to thank staff for a long haul on working on this plan. It's been an awful lot of public input, and I think between the consultants and staff, they've done a very good job of trying to incorporate most of that input. A lot of it has been contradicting each other, so it's the plan so far is, I think, a good balance. As far as one of the audience comments about zoning for hire, we've had zoning for hire for a decade and it's never been built. Silkwinds was zoned for 30-something stories and it's a hole in the ground. The site by Royal Roads entrance was zoned for multi-story and now it's being built as a school at 4 stories. The Colwood Centre was zoned at multi-story and it went bankrupt. So putting the zoning in place doesn't necessarily mean the highest use is going to happen. And one of the other comments was on the step code, and I'd like to get staff to clarify this. It seems to me, I recall step code was being enforced by the building code. Is that correct?
Yeah. That is correct. So the province has outlined a timeline that would see us into, I think, is it 2038? I think 2032 that we're going to be getting to the top of the step code. They have also allowed municipalities to jump ahead of that timeline by opting into steps. What we're proposing is that council consider a phased approach of that moving up what's possible within the existing building code. So that is basically it.
Having just gone through building my own house, I can tell you that the amount of cost from the new building code has gone up exponentially, and it's going to go up again with new electrical code. And I agree, there is no affordable housing in Colwood. There is none in the Western region. There's none in Vancouver. When your average house price is pushing $600,000, it's not affordable. I don't see any way of any committee, any council, or any city being able to answer that question without having their own gigantic land base where they can cut the cost of the land down. But I do agree that where changes to what we require under green building or step code, I will be looking at very carefully to weigh the cost-benefit ratio.
Thank you. Cynthia.
Thanks. I just want to make a quick comment about the affordability. I did attend a workshop with the CRD on the implementation of the STEP code and attended presentations of passive home builds in Victoria, some that were complete and being lived in, some that were under construction, also a commercial build that was also at the highest level of the STEP code. I think it's called Code 3 for commercial buildings. And it was very interesting, and we heard from developers on that particular trip. So, and this is something that goes back to before we brought in Solar Colwood to try to take that longer-term view, what we could do to reduce the overall costs associated with having a house in Colwood. So certainly one of the passive homes that we went to, her electric bill for the entire year, including her heating, was $200. So that goes a long way to improving the affordability. I'm sure there was an offsetting upfront cost in order to produce that home in that way, but it was one of the presentations that really caught my attention was the developer who explained that the most important step he felt that we could take towards better home building was the mid-build blower test, where they actually can look at before the building is completely complete and determine if there are air leakages or installations that haven't quite gone as well as they should. So those are all things that really honestly contribute, and I can attest to that because my house was built in 1974. I've just spent a lot of brute energy getting my firewood all in order for the next, I think, 5 to 7 years. It's burnt very judiciously in a CSA approved. I try to make sure no one even knows that I'm burning wood in my neighborhood. Very careful with that. But those things make a big difference. You know, when I can reduce my electricity bill by a couple $100 a month through local sequestered carbon and sweat equity, I like to do that. So the upshot of the tour that I took was the recommendation that Code 3 was, or Step Code 3 was achievable and didn't necessarily have to cost a lot more. It's a learning curve, I'm sure, and like everything, I'm not a house builder, so you probably wouldn't tell me how to bake a cake, and I won't tell you how to build a house, but I think there are ways. There certainly seem to be a good recipe book or two out there on ways to make housing more affordable over time. And I think that's with global warming and climate adaptation taking place is more and more important to us. Now I've lost my other, oh yes. Just specific comments on the draft. I really, I have to admit to being a skeptic when it comes to official community plans. I've seen plenty of them. I've been involved since the South Colwood Local Area Plan was first created. I think that was 1991. And they usually have pretty pictures, and the devil is always in the details, and it's really hard to get that right. But I do think that the plan that's presented here is a pretty fair representation of the feedback that we've received from the community, and we've done a good job. And huge kudos to staff for the job that they've done. There hasn't been anything that the city does, anything, that we haven't talked about the official community plan at, which I think is a great thing. Is there, you didn't have to come to a special workshop just about the official community plan. Anything you were doing was an opportunity to talk about what you would like to see in Colwood in the future, and I think that's wonderful. Couple of quick, somewhat negative comments. I would really like to see the pictures, for example, Colwood Corners and the Royal Bay Waterfront, reflect what's actually there to start with. So the Royal Bay Waterfront, beautiful picture, definitely depicts what people are talking about they'd like to see. But it's set in a sea of green, like it's, you know, there are no existing houses on that hill. So we need to have those existing houses on the hill because it isn't in a sea of green. And the same, I would say, for Colwood Corners. We have a beautiful golf course. We have the beautiful grounds of West Shore Parks and Rec. Anything that is built in that corridor is going to see both of those wonderful things as a real benefit to the area. Even I'm not a golfer, but I like looking at the golf course. It's very pretty. So I just think that we should make it look like Colwood. That's it for me.
Thank you. Carol?
I just want to say to staff and consultants and the team that was working on the steering committee, the public, and all of those that have weighed in on this, I have to agree with Councillor Day. I think this is very reflective of what's been heard in the mix of things. We do have to maintain a flexibility in here, but I think where perhaps past OCPs have been a little loose and too flexible, this here is providing a bit more definition, and if we need to work a bit more on what those definitions are, I'm happy to carry on the conversation and hear more. So don't stop your input. We'll keep collecting and making it part of what we come up with. It is a changing time. I think there's recognition out there that things can be done better, and whether it's through step codes or voluntary or whatever, there's going to be added costs, but if it's done right, I think the benefactor is the homeowner that is only paying that $200 annually for their heat and services. I know I certainly go through a heck of a lot more than that, and there's only 2 of us at home, and I keep the doors closed in the rooms that we're not in and all the rest of it. So I'm tied to the old technology with little opportunity to change things up. But looking forward to seeing where we can lead in the community for the next while.
Thank you. Jason?
Thank you. Just a quick question to staff. We have the maps that show the 200 and 400 meter dots where individual homes are within those distances. I had asked staff to prepare a map that actually showed properties that were in those distances. I was wondering where those were, and I ask that because that's one of the biggest questions I get from people that live in these areas is, how is that going to affect my property? Am I going to have a 4-story house next door to me? And if they could see that map similar to a zoning map, they would get a better idea.
Mr. Chair, the sub-consultant that's doing the mapping work went on vacation And I believe he's back now, and hoping to have that revision this week. We have to be careful. We're getting towards the end of the budget for this project, so this is an additional task that was beyond the original scope. But we are expecting it this week, but we're also trying to manage the resources of the project as well. So.
Thank you. I think this is a very important part because the neighborhood centers are defined within the plan as being within 400 meters of that center, and they're depicted on the OCP maps as a tiny little circle that's probably 50 meters across. So it's really of vital importance to both the homeowners and people that are planning to build in those areas that they know that this property could be 4 stories if it met certain criteria.
Thank you. Lilha?
Great, thank you through the chair. Just echoing what the other councillors and mayor have said, thank you to staff and everyone for your efforts in this process. As a first-time councillor, it has been both exciting and stressful all at the same time, and a really good learning opportunity. So I have 2 points, one regarding density and the other one regarding the transit growth area. So in the OCP, we've highlighted 2 major hubs, Colwood Corners and Seaside Village. And I think what the public has said is we want to protect the neighborhood. We want to keep the small community feel. And I think one of the best ways to protect those areas is through controlled density. That being said, I personally would like to see Colwood Corners and Seaside Village density be higher. So instead of capping at 12 or 15 stories, to see that 20 stories or more. And I think it is important to have it in the document, even if we don't build, say, 30 stories. It reflects what this council has been talking about, providing certainty for residents. So if you move near the center, that you know potentially sometime in the future it could be built out to that size. Sorry, I just also want to say in this time of age that growth is just happening faster than ever. And I think in 20 years, 15 stories is going to be nothing. Our closest neighbor, Victoria, already has a 21-story building. And secondly, regarding transit growth area, having a closer look, I'm a little bit surprised to see that from Seaside Village to Seek Road isn't a transit growth area. I just think already this road is being so highly used, and that it is a main artery connecting Colwood Corners to the Seaside Village. And I guess just asking to staff, what would changing Metchosin Road into a transit growth area look like?
Yeah.
Well, in terms of the map, we would be that blue line would be added, but
it just very informative.
You know, we discussed that we reflected on the submissions we got from the public, and there was comments from the people who lived in that area that they were concerned about the maintenance of their single-family neighborhoods. So that is why we didn't include that as a transit growth area, but certainly it's food for thought in the revisions. There's also limited potential in terms of the way that the current land base has been subdivided. So for significant development activity to happen in that space, we'd have to see consolidation of the properties to allow for development sites to be created.
And just one more comment. Thank you. So with the site adaptive planning, again, I think it's one of those game changers you mentioned, and I think in order to see that go through and have it work for everyone, that we should increase density in the 2 hubs that we are highlighting as intended growth areas. Thank you.
Thank you. I just had one question just regarding the land use map and where it shows Ocean Boulevard going right across the spit, and knowing what climate change is doing, and that Ocean Boulevard is eroding. So, is it realistic to show one day that that connection will be lost and the impact on future neighborhoods? What it will be in the future? That might be a tough one.
Yeah.
Maybe a little crystal ball, but
so we're aware that it's a very contentious issue within the community. That there's folks that came out to our engagement sessions and said, "Look, that should return to nature. If there's a breach of that causeway that prevents the road from continuing, nature should be left to its own devices." Others told us that whatever it takes in terms of protecting the shoreline to maintain that transportation link should be undertaken. So it really is a bigger issue potentially than we think this OCP in terms of an important issue that deserves its own focus. We've proposed for the community energy and emissions plan to be revamped and include adaptation strategies in a new plan. So that would be part of the adaptation analysis in terms of sea level rise and climate-related impact to that causeway. That's about it. Yeah.
Thank you. I will just say, I'm really appreciating the comments that came up tonight, and the economy actually resonated with me, and the importance and some reference in this document I think is important. And I will say that this document will not be all things to all people, but what we did clearly hear from the mums and dads and the kids that came to our engagement sessions is that the status quo also is not acceptable. So, there's some things that have occurred over the past years that people that will be left in the community don't want to see again, or they want to see a different way of thinking. And really, we have thought that taking a certain action was acceptable, which clearly residents have told us no. And I'm not sure if there's some middle ground in terms of site adaptive planning, but certainly there's a discussion that needs to happen, and I'm aware of a plan actually that's here that actually adopted the site adaptive planning principles and looks to be very successful. And so that tells me that if one developer was able to utilize site adaptive planning, it tells me that it's practical. Maybe not in every situation, but certainly it's something that they saw as value. And these, philosophically, you're not going to see. There's not many neighborhoods where you can drive down like Tipton, where you see full growth fir trees that really add character to a neighborhood. So, again, I don't think it's business as usual, but the folks that came out to the engagement sessions are people that are going to be staying within the community long after development is complete. And so they told us that the status quo is not an option. So I think there's a lot of work to happen, of course, and a lot of feedback to get. But so I think we're going down the right road, and I think there's going to be some tweaks. And I appreciate. I agree with Councillor Nault in terms of being detailed in the mapping, so people in the neighborhoods knew precisely what falls in that 200 or 400 meter circle. So there's absolutely no surprises. And I think it's if we need to spend a couple more bucks to make sure that stuff is right, then I think it's money well spent and it's investment. So with that, Rob, you had another.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I just want to follow up on what Councillor Sean was talking about. So I'm looking at page 33 of the OCP, or the draft, and you mentioned about how we're not making Metchosin Road a transit corridor. And I guess my question to staff then, through the chair, is how do we anticipate, as we continue to build out Royal Bay and Olympic View and all those people, how are those people getting out if we're not building some sort of transit corridor, either through veterans or through Metchosin? We seem to be sort of in denial, but the fact of the matter is that it's going to become a transit corridor. As much as we might not want it, I mean, that just seems to be reality. So it seems a little bit like we're putting our head in the sand on this if we're not going to even acknowledge it. So I guess I'm trying to understand how are we addressing that as we try and densify Royal Bay and Olympic View?
Ian?
Councillor Knott may have something to add, but I'll just start off by mentioning that thank you. We did talk to Transit. We are showing what they're calling their frequent transit corridor, which includes Metchosin Road on page 71. So this is an acknowledgement of the future corridor. What we did not propose is to support that corridor with additional density. So we are acknowledging that this will become, as BC Transit has identified, a frequent transit corridor. It's that we're not calling for those densities to go along with that, primarily because of the two reasons I outlined previously.
Thicker lines, bigger density. Okay, seeing no further speakers, we will, the next date actually, I'll move to the final public participation. So this is your chance now to give us some additional feedback before we close off the meeting.
Congratulations, I guess. I didn't know what to expect for a committee of the whole, but personally, I like the way the agenda has been set up, the opportunity for the public to participate at each and every agenda item instead of always at the beginning, and even furthermore at the end as you have now. So I would highly encourage that you keep this format. How the agenda evolves over time is TBD. We'll see what comes up, but I like the way this is. Personally, I like the way this is unfolding. So, congrats.
Thank you, Dave.
I just wanted to wish you all a Merry Christmas.
Thank you, and from us to you as well. It's a good time to reflect, and I do want to say too, if there's no further speakers. We were looking at the next meeting, and I know here it says January 2nd, and I think everyone's probably still going to be recovering from their rum and eggnog. January 1st, that's right. So I think the date is actually supposed to be, what, the 15th of January?
So on the agenda page, Jen, it says that the next meeting is January the 2nd, but in the timeline report, it indicates that that's actually a staff meeting, and the committee of the whole is the 15th.
And I'll let our Director of Administration comment if she wishes to, but our timeline simply speaks to the budget-related committee of the whole meetings. We did not intend to piggyback on the January 2nd scheduled committee of the whole meeting.
Okay.
So in Appendix A, Pat, it references the next committee of the whole meeting to deal with budget information.
But that's just budget, isn't it?
So are we? I'm just wondering, do we have a regular committee of the whole on January the 2nd? So we're not.
Through you, Mr. Chair. My understanding when the timeline was being done, and then just through general discussions with staff, I understood there was going to be a budget/OCP update for January the 2nd. So I didn't develop the timelines. We just did the calendar based on that. So if there isn't a budget meeting that night and there isn't an OCP update that night, today we don't know that we need a committee of the whole meeting, but that can change over the next week.
So that will get checked on and we'll get duly notified.
Absolutely.
Okay. Good. Thank you. All right.
I just don't want our general public to miss out on an opportunity to come and visit with us.
That's right. Yeah. All those in favor?